Can you picture this? A man stands trapped inside a massive stone mortar, the kind used to grind grain into powder. But tonight, it is not grain being crushed. It's his body. Around him, executioners raise enormous iron pestles, their arms trembling with the weight. The air smells of blood, stone dust, and terror. The first blow crashes down, cracking bone. The man collapses, but through lips torn and bleeding, he spits words that burn hotter than the iron. "Pound the sack of Anaxarchus. You cannot pound the spirit of Anaxarchus." Who was this man who mocked death, even as his body was shattered like grain? To answer, we must unravel the dark path of philosophy, tyranny, and revenge in the ancient world. Before we descend into this nightmare of crushed bones and broken pride, make sure you subscribe to Historica, smash that like button, and share this with someone who thinks history is boring. Comment your country below. Let's see which nation fears no tyrant. Anaxarchus of Abdera was no ordinary philosopher. He lived in the 4th century BCE, in a time when philosophy wasn't a quiet classroom pursuit, but a dangerous art. Ideas could offend kings, and one wrong word could mean death. Born in the Thracian city of Abdera, the same home as Democritus, the father of atomism, Anaxarchus inherited a radical tradition. The atomists believed that all things, even gods, were made of indivisible particles. The soul itself was just atoms moving in the void. This was a scandalous thought in a world where religion ruled lives. To say the gods were illusions was to mock sacrifice, to strip priests of their power, and to laugh at superstition. Anaxarchus embraced that laughter. He was called the Laughing Philosopher because he used mockery as a weapon. Where others argued with logic, he pierced with ridicule. He enjoyed exposing kings as fragile, reminding them they too would rot. His tongue was sharper than any sword. In an age where philosophy was expected to inspire virtue or obedience, he delighted in tearing illusions apart. This made him both admired and despised. When Alexander the Great marched on his conquests, Anaxarchus joined him. He wasn't just a traveling companion. He was a thinker who dared whisper dangerous truths into the ears of soldiers and kings alike. Alexander admired philosophers, but feared them too. He longed to be seen as divine, as the son of Zeus Ammon. But men like Anaxarchus could laugh that claim into dust. That tension made their relationship fascinating and deadly. In the courts of Asia, Anaxarchus was said to joke freely, even at Alexander's expense. When other philosophers trembled before kings, he smiled and provoked. That earned him a place close to power, but close to danger too. One story tells us that when Alexander once asked why philosophers never bowed, Anaxarchus retorted, "Because kings are only men swollen with pride, not gods deserving worship." Even Alexander at first laughed, but not everyone was amused. Court rivals, sycophants, and rulers who hosted Alexander bristled at Anaxarchus's cutting words. He turned banquets into battles of wit, and every joke was a risk. In India, Alexander ordered the philosopher Callisthenes executed for criticizing his tyranny. Anaxarchus, however, survived. His laughter made him untouchable, or so it seemed. He wore defiance like armor. But laughter is a double-edged sword. For the man who mocks everyone makes enemies everywhere. And enemies wait for their moment. Years later, that moment came in Cyprus, where Anaxarchus crossed paths with King Nicocreon of Salamis. At first, their relationship was cordial. The king admired philosophers and wanted a taste of Greek wisdom. But Anaxarchus didn't flatter tyrants. He didn't play safe. One jest too many, one insult too sharp, and he turned Nicocreon from host into executioner. The philosopher who laughed at kings was about to meet a king who never laughed. And in that collision, blood would flow. because mocking a tyrant in the ancient world wasn't a joke. It was a death sentence. And for Anaxarchus, it would lead not just to death, but to one of the most grotesque executions ever recorded. Cyprus was no peaceful island paradise. In the 4th century BCE, it was a contested jewel in the Mediterranean, a land rich in copper, grain, and harbors caught between empires. Whoever controlled Cyprus controlled trade routes and war fleets. Kings ruled its city-states like private kingdoms. Their palaces were built on exploitation, and their crowns were bought with blood. Salamis, one of the greatest cities, was under the reign of Nicocreon. His name whispered fear long before Anaxarchus mocked him. Nicocreon rose to power by navigating a dangerous game. He had bent the knee to Alexander the Great when Macedonian armies came storming through. Like many rulers, he traded independence for survival. That bargain bought him his throne and filled him with paranoia. For tyrants never rule securely. They fear daggers in the dark, whispers at court, and laughter among the people. Nicocreon was no exception. He clung to his power with violence and suspicion. Accounts describe him as brutal, calculating, and merciless toward anyone who defied him. Executions in his court were not just punishments, but performances, staged to instill terror. His rule depended on fear as much as on swords. For a time, Anaxarchus's reputation as Alexander's companion shielded him. Philosophers carried prestige, and Nicocreon entertained him as a guest. A famous Greek thinker could lend legitimacy to a king otherwise seen as provincial. But Anaxarchus had a fatal flaw. He could not resist speaking truth as mockery. Where other philosophers cloaked their critiques in riddles, he struck directly, laughing at the pretensions of rulers. At a banquet, it is said, he joked that Nicocreon was nothing more than a petty king ruling ants on an island too small to matter. A jest to him, but poison to a tyrant's ears. The insult did not vanish into the night. Courtiers, rivals, and servants repeated it. The joke spread in whispers and smirks. And, to Nicocreon, nothing was more dangerous than laughter behind his back. A tyrant may forgive rebellion, but never ridicule. For rebellion can be crushed with steel, but ridicule spreads like fire. Intangible, uncontrollable, impossible to stamp out. Nicocreon's rage boiled into obsession. He waited for the moment when Anaxarchus' prestige would not protect him. He plotted not only to kill the philosopher, but to kill him in a way that erased the power of his laughter. But how do you destroy a man who mocks death itself? How do you silence a philosopher who believes the soul is only atoms, who sneers at gods, who spits on kings? Nicocreon's answer was brutality. If Anaxarchus mocked kings, he would be crushed in the most humiliating way possible. His execution had to be more than death. It had to be desecration. Some sources suggest Nicocreon considered burning him alive, as Alexander had done to another philosopher in India. Others suggest crucifixion, the punishment reserved for slaves and traitors. But those were common spectacles. Nicocreon wanted something unforgettable. He ordered a giant stone mortar brought to the marketplace, the kind used to grind grain into flour. Only this time, the grain would be a philosopher's flesh. To pound a man alive in a mortar was not just murder, it was ritualized destruction. It reduced him to dust, stripped him of dignity, and made his death a warning. When Anaxarchus learned of the sentence, he did not tremble. He laughed, they say, as if the tyrant's cruelty was nothing more than a jest. That laughter only enraged Nicocreon further. The stage was set. The philosopher who mocked tyrants was about to meet one who would answer mockery with horror. The mortar was waiting. The pestles had been forged. The crowd would soon gather. And in that moment, philosophy itself would be put on trial. Could reason, laughter, and defiance survive when bones were smashed to powder? Or would tyranny silence even the boldest tongue? The day of the execution dawned heavy with dread. In Salamis, word spread quickly. The philosopher who mocked kings was to be destroyed in a way no man had ever seen. The people poured into the marketplace, drawn by curiosity, horror, and fear. At the center stood the mortar, a monstrous bowl carved from stone, large enough for a man to curl inside. It had been dragged from the mills, still carrying the scent of crushed grain. But today, it would not grind bread for life, but flesh for spectacle. Nicocreon entered the square in regal splendor, surrounded by guards bristling with spears. His face was cold, his eyes alight with cruelty. For him, this was no ordinary punishment. It was theater, a tyrant's lesson, written in blood and screams. Then came Anaxarchus, dragged in chains. His body bruised, his face swollen from beatings, but his lips curled in a mocking smile. The crowd gasped. Even at death's door, the philosopher laughed. "Is this your justice, Nicocreon?" he shouted. "To grind grain with men? Shall you bake bread with my bones?" His words dripped with scorn. The king's jaw tightened, but he gave no reply. Guards forced Anaxarchus into the mortar. He struggled little, as if amused by the absurdity of it all. His body bent awkwardly within, like a man stuffed into his own tomb. Around him, executioners hefted iron pestles, their muscles trembling with the weight. The crowd fell silent. Then came the first blow. The iron slammed onto his shoulder with a crack that echoed like thunder. Bones splintered. Anaxarchus gasped, then laughed through clenched teeth. "Strike harder," he cried. "You pound only the sack of Anaxarchus, not his spirit." The words rang out, defiance forged from agony. Another blow fell, smashing ribs. Blood spurted, staining the white stone. His body convulsed, but his tongue lashed sharper than ever. Each jest cut deeper into Nicocreon's pride. The tyrant leaned forward, his face twisted with rage. Every word of defiance was poison. He wanted cries for mercy. Instead, he was mocked with laughter. The philosopher was turning his own execution into philosophy. The pestles rose and fell in rhythm, pounding flesh into pulp, grinding bone to powder. The mortar became slick with blood. The crowd watched in horror, but none dared speak. Fear sealed their lips. Yet Anaxarchus spoke for them all. Even as his jaw broke, even as teeth shattered, he forced words through broken lips. "Kings are but men. Men are but dust, and dust cannot rule dust." Nicocreon's hand shook. He had wanted silence, submission. Instead, the man in the mortar was immortalizing himself with every word. Rage overtook him. He ordered the blows harder, faster, until the sound of pestle on stone drowned all else. But still, fragments of voice broke through. Laughter, coughing, words that no iron could crush. "Pound! Pound! You destroy nothing but meat. Anaxarchus still mocks you." The executioners faltered, horrified at the spectacle they were part of. Yet Nicocreon's glare drove them on. Blow after blow, until flesh was torn, bones dust, and only a mangled mass remained. Finally, silence fell. Not because the philosopher had begged, but because his body could no longer produce sound. His last breath was laughter, his last words defiance. The mortar overflowed with blood and fragments of bone. The square stank of iron and death. The crowd trembled, unable to decide what was more terrifying, Nicocreon's cruelty or the philosopher's courage. Nicocreon declared victory, but he looked uneasy. He had destroyed the body, yes, but the spirit of Anaxarchus had escaped, His defiance would be remembered far longer than the king's wrath. The tyrant returned to his palace, but his victory was hollow. He had staged a spectacle of power, yet the lesson the people carried was not fear of their king, but awe of the man who laughed while being pounded alive. The mortar remained in the square, stained forever red. People avoided it, whispering of the philosopher who had turned his own death into philosophy, and the tyrant who had tried to crush a soul, but failed. When the pestles finally fell still, Salamis was silent. The people had witnessed something they could not forget. A man destroyed like grain, yet undefeated in spirit. His laughter still rang in their ears, sharper than any sword. Nicocreon had intended to write his power in blood. Yet, in trying to silence Anaxarchus, he had given him immortality. For every whisper in the crowd carried not the king's name, but the philosopher's. This is the paradox of tyranny. Cruelty can frighten, but it can also inspire. By destroying Anaxarchus, Nicocreon created a legend. His cruelty became a mirror in which his weakness was revealed. In the Greek world, philosophers were often mocked for being useless dreamers. But Anaxarchus proved that words alone could terrify a king. A laugh could wound deeper than a blade. A jest could haunt a tyrant's sleep. Even Alexander the Great, who had crushed empires, understood this danger. He executed philosophers when they mocked his divinity. Yet those deaths lived on as stains upon his glory. Power always resented laughter. Nicocreon's problem was greater. Unlike Alexander, who had the world at his feet, Nicocreon ruled a small island kingdom. His insecurity magnified every insult. A petty king cannot afford to be laughed at, and so he lashed out. But history is cruel to tyrants who kill philosophers. Their names fade, their kingdoms crumble, while the words of the executed endure. Who remembers Nicocreon today, except as the butcher of a thinker? Anaxarchus' philosophy was radical even before his death. As a disciple of Democritus, he believed all reality was atoms in the void. To him, pain was only atoms colliding, fleeting sensations without eternal meaning. This worldview gave him terrifying courage. When crushed, he could laugh, because to him, suffering was illusion. Death was not punishment, but dissolution into the same dust as kings. By dying as he did, Anaxarchus turned his philosophy into flesh. His execution became his final lecture, a demonstration that spirit could not be crushed, even when bones were. Greek writers after him recorded his words with awe. "Pound the sack of Anaxarchus, you do not pound his spirit," became a refrain, quoted in schools and taverns alike. Even centuries later, his defiance was remembered. Nicocreon, by contrast, vanished into obscurity. His tyranny was nothing compared to the vast sweep of Hellenistic history. But his cruelty, tied to Anaxarchus, condemned him to infamy. Philosophers debated his death. Was Anaxarchus brave or foolish? Did he win a victory in defiance, or did he throw his life away on mockery? The question itself gave his story weight. For common people, however, the lesson was simpler. Laughter could be mightier than the throne. They may have feared Nicocreon's guards, but they whispered Anaxarchus' words, and in that whisper lay resistance. Tyrants understand this better than anyone. That is why they burn books, exile poets, silence critics. They fear not the sword, but the jest, because jesters plant doubt, and doubt topples thrones. The mortar of Anaxarchus became a symbol. It was no longer just a stone tool, but a memory etched into Cyprus's soil. People avoided it, fearing the stain of injustice, yet they could not erase it from their minds. Every blow of the pestle became a reminder of the fragility of power. If even kings must resort to crushing philosophers to prove their strength, how strong are they really? The politics of blood always reveal weakness. A confident ruler ignores insults. A fearful one kills the insulter, and in so doing, immortalizes him. That is why today, across centuries, we still speak the name of Anaxarchus. His bones may have been ground to powder, but his laughter outlived empires. And Nicocreon? His kingdom has crumbled to dust, his throne long forgotten. His only legacy is the role he played in another man's immortality, the tyrant who killed a philosopher and lost to his laughter. Anaxarchus' story is not just about one man's death. It is about the price of truth in an age when words could kill. To mock a tyrant was not simply dangerous, it was suicidal. And yet, he did it anyway. What drove him? Was it arrogance or conviction? Did he truly believe pain was meaningless, atoms colliding in the void? Or was his laughter a mask, concealing terror, defiance clung to as a final shield? Philosophers since have argued both sides. To some, he was a martyr of free speech, a man who proved that even when flesh is broken, the spirit remains unshaken. To others, he was reckless, courting death with needless arrogance. But history rarely remembers caution. It remembers those who dared. And Anaxarchus dared to laugh where others begged. That alone secured his immortality. Still, his story is also a warning. For every philosopher who defied power and was remembered, countless others perished in silence, erased by fear. For every Anaxarchus, there were dozens ground to dust with no legacy. The cost of defiance is always death. The reward is uncertain, maybe immortality, maybe oblivion. And no man can know which until long after the pestles fall. In the ancient world, executions were theater. Crucifixion lined roads with corpses, impalement raised bodies into the sky, and burning alive lit the night. They were meant to terrify. Anaxarchus turned his execution into a stage for defiance. That made it more dangerous. For the crowd, the image of a laughing man being crushed was unforgettable. Tyranny sought to inspire fear, but courage inspired resistance. And this raises the most haunting question. Who truly won that day in Salamis? Nicocreon, who destroyed the body, or Anaxarchus, who triumphed in spirit? Perhaps the answer lies in memory. We remember Anaxarchus, not Nicocreon. We repeat the philosopher's words, not the king's orders. The victor in history is the one who cannot be silenced. Yet we cannot romanticize too much. His death was not clean. His body was shattered, his flesh mangled, his bones ground into fragments. Pain was real, agony unrelenting. Philosophy could not spare him the suffering. That is the cruelty of courage. We admire it, but would we endure it? Could we laugh as pestles shattered our ribs? Could we speak as our jaws cracked? Few could. That is why Anaxarchus remains both admired and unsettling. His death forces us to confront our own limits. We love to believe we would defy tyranny, but history shows most bow their heads. Anaxarchus shows what defiance looks like: bloody, broken, and unforgettable. It also shows how fragile rulers are. If a king must crush a man in a mortar to prove his strength, how weak must he feel inside? Tyranny always reveals itself in overreaction. The lesson of Anaxarchus lives on. Words are dangerous, laughter even more so. Power can command swords, but it cannot control mockery. That is why tyrants fear philosophers, poets, and jesters most of all. And yet, courage has a cost. Anaxarchus paid it in full. He became immortal not in body, but in story. A story written in pain and blood, carried across centuries as both inspiration and warning. So ask yourself, was he a fool who threw his life away? or a hero who proved that spirit outlives flesh? The answer says less about him and more about us. History is not just battles and kings. It is voices like Anaxarchus, crushed yet undefeated. If his story unsettled you, honor his defiance. Subscribe to Historica, share this tale, and comment your country below. Let his laughter echo through us. And if you thought being pounded alive in a mortar was horror enough, wait until you hear of the nobleman who lured children into his castle and butchered them by the hundreds. A tale so dark, it makes Anaxarchus' torment seem merciful.